Dr. Paul Conti.
Paul Conti, MD.
Dr. Paul Conti.
I think often substance abuse is dealt with and thought of as an illness, and in a way the responsibility is kind of taken away. I'm wondering what powers that in people, why there's such a strong synergy between substance abuse and trauma.
Trauma paves the way to substances. So it's our responsibility and for the societies around us that we don't accept the appeal of the short-term soothing.
Intergenerational trauma, so for example, the trauma of the Jewish people and the Holocaust kind of gets passed on.
Children, for example, of Holocaust survivors had higher levels of anxiety, and traumas that are perpetuated during wartime have been seen mostly through a criminal lens. But now that the conception has shifted to say that trauma can affect that person not only for the rest of their lives, but it can affect their children.
This story of the patient who was driving just to tell themselves that they were worthless, etc., I guess, is a perfect example of why you call shame one of the major accomplices to trauma. But I wanted to ask you why you think shame is the one that particularly sticks around. When we feel happy, for example, it's a fleeting thing, or when we feel fulfilled, it's fleeting, and yet somehow people can get caught in a cycle of shame for a very long time. Why do you think that is, and why do you think it's so incisive?
Sure. So shame occurs in us as a reflex to trauma. So just like as a physician, I can tap the hammer on someone's knee and the knee comes out. It's a reflex. Shame is a reflex also. A reflex to trauma is ashamed. How many people have I heard who were assaulted with no fault of their own whatsoever? So they're in a place it's okay for them to be, and someone attacks them, someone hits them. They talk about a feeling of what's wrong with them, that they're ashamed they were there. They're ashamed they were dressed the way they were. They're ashamed they were talking to who they were talking. And you think that person would never, never, never say that to another human being. Right? Someone who is walking down the street, or it's dusk, they're assaulted, something bad happens to them, to say, oh, you know what? That was your fault, right? But we will say those things to ourselves, right? Because the shame is a reflex inside of us. And then we hide the shame away. So the same way, if there's an infection, in us, we need to open the infection up to the light. We need to put some antibiotic cream on the infection. So if we have an infection on the outside of us and we just hide it away, well, let's just, let's completely cover it up, and we're not going to look at it. We're not going to open it up to the air. What happens is that infection can spread. And this is what goes on inside of us. Why would the shame go away if it festers inside of us and we don't expose it to the light of day, right, to the sunlight of thought and discussion that would essentially fix it, that would make it go away? Why would it go away? It doesn't, right? What it does is it gets worse. And now maybe the shame I feel when I don't feel good enough leads me to act more unhealthily. Maybe I'm drinking more and I'm more irritable with people around me, like things that happened after my own trauma when I was younger. Well, that doesn't go so well. Then, I was spending time with people who maybe weren't the greatest to spend time with, people who had their own issues, weren't wanting to move their lives ahead, maybe weren't looking at themselves any more than I would, but than I was at the time. But then negative things happen in life, and then I feel worse about myself. And then I start telling myself, what's wrong with me? And, so this is what happens, and it happens so often. And I've seen it in my own life. And after going to medical school and becoming a psychiatrist, I've seen 20-something years of this happening in people. And what's remarkable is how preventable it is. I mean, again, you're asking a great question, like, why does this come into us and then it stays and it festers and it gets worse? Well, if it's a reflex and then we hide it away from the light of day and then build up all these unhealthy defenses around it, that's why. And that's why we see it en masse in millions of people. And and I have to say, and their brains are changed. Again, it's not, pull oneself up by one's bootstraps. Like, it's not that. Our traditions in understanding trauma come from combat trauma. Some of that observation in science occurring in the United Kingdom after the wars earlier in the century. People who were shell-shocked, right, of realizing, whoa, like a person is very, very different after the trauma they went through. And we've learned a lot in the last 100 years, but have we really learned a lot in terms of understanding and creating change? Maybe not so much.
You speak about the brain. So the way I'm trying to understand it is also this idea of the micro and the macro. You have an individual trauma, but there's perhaps also this idea of a collective trauma, which we also discussed in relation to the Holocaust. And I wanted to maybe complicate it a little bit and bring up the idea of German collective guilt. As a someone half German myself, I've noticed that in my family, and my family wasn't kind of didn't descend from Nazis, but you still notice that there's a shame, and there's the thing that we call the silent generation, this idea of shaming oneself, bringing things, kind of pushing things away. So while we talked about Holocaust survivors having trauma in the sense that they were the victims, you have the perpetrators of the Holocaust, so Germany, and shame and guilt, and in some sense trauma, though from a very different angle, being passed down throughout generations and being very suppressed, in that perhaps the country itself can't heal itself, if you understand what I mean by that.
Yes. So I think you're bringing up something very, very important, this idea of collective guilt and guilt that's passed on, because when you think of when the Holocaust occurred, I don't know what percentage of people, of living Germans now, were alive during that period of time. It's going to be a very, very small percentage of the population. But as you said, the guilt gets passed down, as we see at times in the United States around slavery. We see where the guilt gets passed down. And if it is hidden away, if it is denied, if we make conflict around it with others who do not want to deny it, then we perpetuate it and make it worse. I mean, I am not a great expert on how Germany across the years has handled the Holocaust, but in some of what I have read, and I spent some time in Germany as well, I think that Germany has done an admirable job of facing it, of acknowledging it, of saying this happened here, and we're not trying to hide it. And there are monuments and memorials, and people talk about it. Again, I don't know if it feels that way, being from Germany. And again, I'm just an outsider coming in or reading books or literature. But I have always perceived there to be a greater openness in Germany to acknowledgement than there is, for example, in the United States around slavery or other elements of trauma. And I think then we're opening it up to the light of day of what does it mean that this happened in our nation, right? What were the social forces or the institutional forces? How have we learned from it? Have we learned the lessons of history? And I know, of course, that Germany is one of the most all-inclusive democracies on earth now. And Germany took in Syrian refugees when a lot of other nations didn't. I mean, I think a lot of what has happened is Germany learning in the sense of people wanting to take responsibility and saying, well, whether I was alive then, whether, I'm from a lineage that had some hand in that or didn't, it doesn't really matter. Those things don't matter. What matters is that I'm here now. Right. And I'm here now and I'm part of this place. I'm a citizen of this place. And I want to learn and understand so that we not only prevent tragedy, but we look outward to make the world a better place. And this could be said of everyone everywhere. Right. I mean, there are collective traumas that come down to people just by being human. And I do think that there are ways Germany sets an example of let's look right at this, because otherwise, how are we going to learn from the lessons of the past? And I'm sure more of that could be done by all of us. But in general, we tend to push down collective trauma. And, in the book that I wrote, Stephanie von Gutenberg, who is a German child advocate, I interviewed both Darren Richerter, who is a psychiatrist at Stanford, who I referenced previously, about the brain science and brain changes and trauma. And I also interview in the book Countess von Gutenberg, because she understands. She's written about what happens when trauma befalls children, the most vulnerable part of life, to set these unhealthy pathways in us. How do we understand it? How do we avoid it? So I think we have to look directly at what is traumatic and what lessons we can learn, whether it's the Holocaust, it's child trafficking in the present, right? It's all the things that the vectors of our species continue to point towards greater destruction, which I think it's hard to argue. When you see the history in recent times, that we aren't moving towards a destruction that threatens us all, that threatens the survival of the species. And I think we need to look more at the traumas in individuals and in societies that drive unhealthy and destructive behavior, and will drive it unless we look at it and we turn those things into lessons of healing, of health, of prevention.
Ever shown up to the beach with a big bush, getting rejected left, right and centre, so you have to walk away with your pubes between your legs? Then get yourself a Manscaped and rule the beach. Wear your shorts with no shame. Get the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra now with a discount code LOAF to get a full 20% off, so that your baguette leaves no crumbs.
Hey guys, hope you enjoyed the clip from our interview with Dr. Paul Conti. Drop a like and subscribe for more content. If you have any thoughts, leave a comment down below. If you'd like to check out the full interview, you can click right here. Stay tuned for more.